I was stacking firewood behind the barn when I heard it. Not an engine, not a voice. Metal. The sound of steel being torn free of concrete. I walked toward the road and stopped at the edge of the property, and that's when I saw the excavator, parked on my land, bucket down, ripping the deck off my bridge. I was an hour and a half from home. My neighbor was standing on the ridge across the gorge, watching through binoculars like she was at a horse race. What I didn't know yet was that the woman tearing apart my grandfather's bridge had just made the biggest mistake of her life, because that bridge wasn't just my way across. It was the only way into her neighborhood. And in about 2 hours, 38 families were about to find out the hard way that their HOA president had just cut off their only exit. To understand why this mattered, I have to take you back to where it started. That bridge had been in my family for 62 years. My grandfather built it in 1961, salvaged steel from an old rail spur, poured the abutments himself into the limestone rim, and bolted the whole thing together with boards he believed would outlast him. It did. By the time I inherited it, it had carried logging trucks, school buses, hay wagons, and, starting about 15 years ago, the daily traffic of 38 families. See, when my father sold the east parcel to a developer, the subdivision that went up had one problem. There was no road to it. Every approach meant either a 14-mile detour over a mountain or blasting through solid rock. So the developer came to my father's kitchen table and asked for permission to cross our land. My father, who was the kind of man who helped a neighbor before being asked, agreed. On one condition, he had his attorney draft a license. Not an easement, a license, which means it belonged to us, could be revoked at any time, and expired the moment my father's name was no longer on it. Every car that crossed that bridge after he passed was technically on borrowed ground. I kept it open anyway. I maintained the deck, graded the road, let the families drive across twice a day. I didn't charge anyone. I figured they were my neighbors, and I didn't need a piece of paper to be decent. My attorney told me to formalize it. Your father said the same thing, he warned me, and he was right up until someone came along who didn't deserve the decency. He was right about that too. A little over a year ago, a new neighbor moved into the big house on the ridge. Let's call her Mrs. Davenport. She'd come from the city, the kind of person who measures her worth by square footage and treats anything west of the suburbs as the sticks. She ran for HOA president about 6 months after moving in, and she won, mostly because the men who showed up to the meeting couldn't remember her platform, just the way she smiled. She was efficient. Within 2 months, she'd issued a pile of violation notices over things that had never bothered anyone before. A mailbox post painted the wrong shade of green, a flagpole 3 inches too long, a retired nurse fined for a bicycle rack her kids used. Cruelty dressed up as caring. She had a way of making you feel like she was genuinely sorry, and then you'd look at the fine and realize she'd been smiling the whole time. I stayed out of her path. My land wasn't part of her association. I wasn't subject to her rules. I was just the man who owned the bridge that made her little kingdom reachable. And as long as she left me alone, I was happy to let her terrorize people who'd signed up for it. That lasted about 18 months. Then one Thursday afternoon, she pulled up in her pearl white SUV while I was stacking firewood. She got out, crossed her arms, and said, "We need to talk about your bridge." I told her the bridge was fine. It had passed inspection 7 months earlier, rated for more than 20 tons. She didn't care about that. "It's revolting," she said. "My residents paid hundreds of thousands of dollars for their homes, and the first thing they see every morning is a pile of rusty steel and rotting wood. It's disgusting. It makes me physically ill. I want it gone." I set down the splitting maul. "Ma'am, it's my property. Your HOA has no authority over it." She smiled. The kind of smile a woman gives when she's already decided the furniture's moving. And this conversation is just the noise the furniture makes before she rearranges it. "We'll see about that, sweetheart." She started with paperwork. Official-looking letters demanding I upgrade the bridge to community standards she'd invented. Then she hired a handyman, not an engineer, a deck pressure washer, to write a structural assessment, claiming the bridge was at risk of imminent failure. She mailed copies to the county, to the state. The county inspector, who I'd known for years, drove out, checked it, and called me that night. "Your bridge is fine," he said. "Better than half the bridges in this county." That woman sent me an 8-page packet of photos that make it look like it's about to fall into the creek. Camera angles and bad faith. The state sent it back with a note. Private bridge, private property, not our jurisdiction. So she turned to public pressure. A social media page. Weekly posts. Our children cross this every day. A stock photo of a collapsed bridge from another country, captioned as if it were mine. She posted my property records. She wrote, "This is the man who controls your only road." 3 neighbors supported her. 29 stayed silent. 6 told me privately they thought she'd lost her mind. When the government wouldn't act, she went to the HOA and moved to fund a lawsuit against me. A retired principal asked what legal theory she planned to pursue. She said, "Safety trumps property rights." He said, "Not around here, it doesn't." But she got her votes. She raised the money, hired a lawyer, and sued, claiming years of use had given the neighborhood a permanent right to my bridge. My attorney pulled out the original license and pointed to the one line my father had insisted on. No use would ever create a permanent right-of-way. The judge dismissed the case in 11 days, calling it bordering on frivolous. Her lawyer quit the following week. You'd think that would have been the end of it. A woman who'd been told by a county inspector, a state agency, a judge, and her own attorney that she had no authority over a bridge she didn't own, you'd think she'd move on. But she had built her entire identity around that neighborhood being a reflection of her taste. And my grandfather's bridge was a splinter in the eye of her vision. No amount of legal reality could dislodge it, so she decided to remove it herself. She found a demolition crew that didn't ask questions. She told them the bridge belonged to the HOA and had been condemned. She paid them cash, and she scheduled it for a Saturday morning, the morning I was an hour and a half away at a timber auction. My neighbor, the retired mail carrier, called me at 8:15. "There's an excavator on your bridge." "What?" "A big yellow one. They're pulling up the deck boards right now. That Davenport woman is standing on the ridge across the gorge watching through binoculars like she's at the Kentucky Derby." I drove home as fast as those mountain roads would allow. By the time I pulled onto my property, the bridge was gone. Not damaged, gone. The steel beams my grandfather had set 62 years earlier were lying twisted in the creek bed below. The planking was splintered across the rocks. The railings had been ripped out and tossed in a pile. I stood at the edge and looked across 50 feet of empty air to where 38 families lived on a ridge that now had no road. My neighbor stood next to me, quiet for a long time. "Wyatt," he said, "does that woman know what she just did?" "I don't think she does, not yet." I called the sheriff and reported the destruction. I called my attorney. He listened without interrupting, then said 2 words. "Don't rebuild." "What?" "Don't touch anything. Don't clean up the debris. Don't talk to her. Document everything. And don't rebuild." "But there are 38 families up there with no way out." 38 families, he said, whose HOA president just committed a felony. "That's not your bridge to replace anymore, Wyatt. That's evidence." And that's when I realized what should have been obvious the moment the excavator hit the first board. She hadn't blocked my access. Most of my land was on this side. She had blocked hers. Every resident who needed to get to work, every child who needed a school bus, every ambulance, every fire engine, all of it needed that bridge. And it was lying in pieces at the bottom of a gorge because one woman thought it was ugly. Let that sink in. She demolished the only road into her own neighborhood because it offended her eyes. That's not just arrogance. That's arrogance so pure it should be studied in a lab. The consequences started within hours. By noon, homeowners were calling each other. The only way off the ridge was a gravel service road, 40 minutes to the nearest pavement, officially closed for the season. By Sunday morning, 38 families were functionally landlocked. A pediatrician with patients waiting Monday morning had to call his office and explain he couldn't get off his own street. His office manager thought he was joking. She stopped laughing when he sent her a photo of the gorge. A woman 8 months pregnant, due in 3 weeks, called the fire department in tears, asking if they could helicopter her out if she went into labor. They couldn't. Her husband drove her the 2-hour ordeal down that mountain road instead, and she told me later she'd had contractions the whole way. The retired principal was the first to show up at her door. He was 73 years old and not the kind of man who raised his voice. But I was told you could hear him from across the street, demanding to know how she planned to get an ambulance up the ridge if his wife had another stroke. She told him she would handle it and closed the door in his face. She could not handle it. Monday morning, the school bus stopped at the gap, saw the chasm, and turned around. 7 kids missed a school. The fire marshal drove up the service road, assessed the situation, and designated the neighborhood a restricted access area. The fire department could no longer guarantee response times. "I've seen subdivisions with bad roads," Honey said. "I've never seen one with no road at all." Tuesday, the first lawsuits were filed against the HOA and against her. Wednesday, a television crew filmed a segment that opened with a drone shot of the empty gorge and the subdivision sitting above it like a castle with the drawbridge burned. The retired principal told the camera, "One woman decided she didn't like the way a bridge looked, and now 38 families can't get to the grocery store." And Thursday afternoon, she came to my property. She'd taken the service road in her pearl white SUV. Picture this, because it was the most satisfying thing I've ever seen with my own eyes. The vehicle she'd used to park across 2 spaces at the mailbox cluster, the one she treated like it owned the road, was destroyed. Red clay caked an inch thick in the wheel wells. A branch had scratched a scar down the entire passenger side. The bumper was dented from a rock. The running boards were bent. The pearl white finish looked like something you'd find abandoned behind a hunting cabin. She got out. The hair she spent a fortune maintaining was pulled back in a rubber band. Her makeup had run in dark streaks. The silk blouse was wrinkled and stained. Her boots were caked in mud, one heel cracked, and she was limping slightly. This was the woman who had fined a retired nurse over a bicycle rack, who'd made an elderly widow cry over the color of a mailbox post, who'd called me sweetheart on my own land. She was standing in my driveway, mascara-streaked, mud-caked, limping, and shaking. "Mr. Jennings," she said, her voice cracked. Not the voice that had called me sweetheart. A different voice, small, fractured. "I need you to rebuild the bridge." I kept sharpening the chain. The sound of metal on metal filled the workshop. I let it go on for about 10 seconds longer than necessary. "No, ma'am, I don't believe I will." She blinked. The eyes that had won every argument she'd ever walked into filled with something I'd never seen in them before. Not tears. Tears would have been too graceful. This was panic. Raw panic. The realization that beauty was not going to fix this. That leaning forward and saying leadership in a low voice was not going to make a 50-foot gorge disappear. "You don't understand," she whispered. "People can't get out." "I understand perfectly, ma'am. I know exactly what happens when a road isn't there. That's the whole point." My attorney had laid out the legal landscape in terms so clear a mule couldn't misunderstand them. Felony destruction of property, criminal trespass, fraud. She'd lied to the contractor about ownership. And the license that had let those families cross my land? Void. The moment that excavator touched the first board, it was gone. I had no obligation to rebuild. None. "File a police report," my attorney said. "File a civil suit. Send a certified letter terminating the license. Post the property. Then wait." Wait for what? Wait for the weight of what she's done to crush her? She landlocked 38 families. She destroyed a bridge that wasn't hers. She did it on camera. And she did it all because she thought rusty steel was ugly. The consequences are going to arrive like dominoes, and every single one is going to fall on her pretty little head. He was right. The demolition crew she'd lied to, horrified when I told them the truth, filed their own suit against her. The district attorney charged her with 2 felonies. 23 homeowners joined a class action over the lost value of their homes. 3 board members resigned, including the ones who'd voted with her on everything. Her insurance company denied coverage. The policy excluded willful and intentional acts. The HOA was uninsured for the largest liability event in its history. And in her final move, she hired another attorney and filed an emergency motion demanding the judge order me to grant access. Public necessity, she called it. My attorney stood up and said 3 sentences. Your Honor, the defendant destroyed the plaintiff's bridge without permission and without legal authority. She now asks this court to force the plaintiff to provide what she destroyed. This is not an equity case. This is a consequences case. The judge denied the motion from the bench. He looked at her attorney and said, and I'll never forget these words, "Counsel, your client tore down the only bridge into her own neighborhood and is now asking the man she victimized to build her a new one. The court is not going to reward that behavior." Motion denied. She pled guilty to felony destruction of property, full restitution, 2 years probation, hundreds of hours of community service, and a permanent no-contact order barring her from my property. When it was all over a few months later, the new board came to see me, the pediatrician and the retired school teacher and the principal who'd stepped back in to lead. They asked if I'd consider a new access agreement. I told them I would, on conditions. My attorney and I drafted a recorded easement, permanent, filed with the county, attached to the land. The HOA would pay for the new bridge. They'd carry liability insurance. They'd pay an annual maintenance fee. And one final clause, my attorney's idea, and the one I like best. Any HOA officer who ever authorized any interference with my property again would automatically trigger a 5-year suspension of the access, with the full cost of alternative access borne by whoever did it. The principal read that clause and looked up. You want to make sure this never happens again. My attorney said, I want to make sure the next one knows the price before she starts shopping. The new bridge went in the following spring. Steel and concrete, rated for more than the old one, with proper guardrails. It honestly looks better than my grandfather's original. But underneath the fresh concrete, the abutments still sit in the same holes he jackhammered into the limestone 63 years ago. The foundation was always the same. As for her, she left. She moved back to the city and, last I heard, joined another association, a gated community whose board has no idea what just moved in. I imagine she's already measuring the mailbox posts. My neighbor asked me once if I felt bad for her. I thought about it honestly. I thought about the nurse she'd find for a bicycle rack, the widow she'd made cry over a shade of green. I thought about my grandfather's bridge, 62 years of family history lying twisted in a creek bed, because one woman thought rusty steel was ugly. No, I said, I don't. Here's what I want you to take from this. That bridge was never just a bridge. It was the line between what was mine and what she thought she could control. And the moment someone decides your property is theirs to rearrange, they aren't enforcing rules anymore. They're trespassing on a boundary. And boundaries only work when people respect them. If you're watching this and wondering what would happen if someone in your neighborhood tried to pull something like this, check your rights. Check what your association can and can't touch. Because the only reason any of this held up is that I had the paperwork, and I didn't rebuild out of guilt. What would you have done if a neighbor tore down something on your land and then asked you to put it back? Drop it in the comments. Hit subscribe if you want more stories about boundaries, property, and karma finding its way home. I post new ones often.